Hello BookTube, I'm Heather and this is Recently Seen Reading, and I have an update for you on how my no borrow month went. Every 6 months or so I put myself on a no borrow for a month. Things typically get out of hand and I have more books borrowed, whether it's in print or electronically, than any reasonable person should have. And lately that tends to be when I get over 35 borrowed books. I clamp down and I put myself on a no borrow, just to kind of move myself towards reading the things I have or letting them go. So I started the month of April with 38 books that I had borrowed, and I finished the month of April with 15. So that means I either read or returned to the library unfinished or not even opened 23. And that's pretty good ratio for me. I'm happy with that. It's an odd process for me to go through this no borrow, because it's kind of exciting at the beginning. I have all these books to get through and it's a challenge. And then by the time I'm two-thirds of the way through, I'm really irritated by the entire process. And that's part of the point. It's the irritation as well as the pleasure. It helps me discern what's actually going on with my reading. So in terms of numbers, I'm happy with that. I certainly didn't read 23 books in April. To get to reading 23 books in a month, I would need to have a stack of genre fiction that I was whipping through really quickly, and I didn't have that. And that has turned out to be one of the things that's really much more crisp for me, that I need to always have a little stack of entertainments, I guess Graham Greene would call them. Things that are, plot-driven, easy to read, and pleasurable to read. And when I get through all of them and don't have any more left, I get crabby if I can't go borrow more. I tend not to buy them because I'm cheap. So that's one of the things that's come out of my reading. My no borrow. The other thing that a no borrow helps me discern is that part of the problem I have is that my public library makes it possible for me to see what books are on order as well as what books have just arrived in the library. So that means that I have a habit now of checking both the print catalog and the ebook catalogs every day to see what's new or what's just been ordered. And there's a huge upside to that, of course. I get to put a book on hold and be, at the very top of the list for something I'm interested in. And it's also a downside. I can put something on hold and then lose interest, and then the book becomes very, very popular because it's, say, a prize winner or on multiple prize lists, but I don't get to it, but I could become reluctant to cancel the hold because, there's now on a print copies or multiple print copies 300 holds, and I'm number 1 on the holds list. It's not likely that I'm going to cancel that hold because I might never get to read it. Okay, this is of course a ridiculous way to behave, but this is the way I behave. So one way I could manage my tendency to borrow too many books would be to stop looking at what's coming in every day. But that seems to take half the pleasure out of it. Knowing what's new or what the library has purchased is pleasurable. So I need to get better at discerning what I'm likely to enjoy. And that's hard. Man, that's really hard for me. Being able to tell before I pick the book up and read the entire thing or half of it, whether I'm going to enjoy it, whether it's a piece of nonfiction or a piece of fiction that's intended to be an entertainment, or whether it's a piece of serious literature. It's so hard. It's so hard to tell because, light reading, genre reading, the pleasure comes from seeing the familiar parts be rearranged and the writing to be quite good. And you often can't tell that, or I can't tell that, till I'm partway through the book. So I don't know whether I'm ever going to be able to get better at discerning what books I'm actually going to enjoy before I pick them up and read them. I don't know how other people do this. How do you discern whether you're going to like a book or not. I haven't found blurbs to be particularly helpful. Prize lists are, can increase the length of my hold list, but they don't always provide satisfactory or excellent reading. 1,001 books to read before you this or that. Those can be hit and miss. This is kind of a perennial problem for me. How do I discern which book I'm actually going to like? And I've read a lot. I'm old, right? I'm old, gray hair. I'm an old lady, and I've read a lot. And I have a finite amount of time ahead of me and an almost infinite number of books. So I'd like to get better at discerning what books I'm going to like, but I'm not sure how to get there. One solution, I suppose, would be to just stop reading a book that I don't think is very good. And I struggle with that because sometimes the book can turn around. The thing that hasn't interested me or something that doesn't seem to work in the prose will turn around in the last third of the book. So I don't like to give up on a book. I don't know. DNFing is hard for me. So that's a lot of kind of palaver about how hard it is to discern what books are going to bring you pleasure. It's hard, man. I did go to the library on the 1st of May, and on the 2nd of May, and on the 4th of May. So I've been to the university library and 2 branches of the public library, plus borrowed books electronically. And that's why I'm back up to, I went from 15 borrowed books on the 30th of April to 26 borrowed books as of today. And I'm okay with that. I think I need to become increasingly okay having a number of borrowed books in the mid-20s. And I also need to get better at noticing when a book has sat on my shelf for more than 2 renewal periods. I can renew print books from the public library for 3 renewals, each one 3 weeks, so I can have a book on my shelf for 9 weeks unread. The university library, I can have a book on my shelf unread for a year or more. So clearly I need to use those renewal cycles to help maneuver my brain a little bit into letting go of some of these books. I think overall getting down to 26 books now sitting on my shelf or on my e-reader or on the floor in the other room, down from 38 to 26 now. I'm okay with that. There weren't a lot of standout books in the ones that I read, and a fair number of them went back unread. So I need to try and choose better. But there are 2 that I quite enjoyed, but they are, I think, Marmite books, probably not books that other people would enjoy as much as I enjoyed. I just want to touch on 2 of them. They're nonfiction books. One is by Leona Rostenberg and Madeline Stern, Old and Rare, 30 Years in the Book Business. And this was published in the 70s, I believe, and there are different versions of it. It got rewritten and expanded as they went on. So Rostenberg and Stern were friends in university in the early 1930s, and eventually became business partners and essentially life partners. Some murkiness around whether they were sexual partners or not. Most likely yes, but it's not part of what they talk about in the book. And they started in the 30s a rare book business. Leona Rostenberg had gone to Columbia and studied early print books, and as part of that education, as part of writing her dissertation, which she eventually finished, she went to France in 1936-ish, 37-ish, maybe earlier than 37, to Salzburg to look at the early print books there. And she was, as a Jewish woman, very conscious that right across the river from her was the Nazi regime, which was a very immediate and certain threat to her. So she was studying early print books in the libraries there and trying to maneuver, gathering enough material for her dissertation with this looming threat in Europe. overseas for education as well, but more of a kind of a grand tour kind of education. Towards the end of the Second World War, they started the business, and they started, like a lot of booksellers started, by buying books that other people thought were worthless, and by scrutinizing books that had been bound together, so pamphlets, a book that was bound together with 3 or 4 pamphlets together, and one of the pamphlets generally being overlooked, but because of their education and their research, they understood what it was and who was a likely purchaser of it. And it's, I think parts of the book are quite amusing and illuminating. If you're interested in the rare book trade, or what it's like or was like for women to work in the book trade, it is an interesting book to read. The first half of it, which covers from mid-20s to about 1952, 1953, is stronger and more interesting in terms of its writing than the second half. They take, Rostenberg and Stern take turns in narrating the chapters, but the first half seems to have been based more on letters they wrote home, either to each other or to their family, as well as diaries. And so in summing that up for a later memoir-type book, the writing's more vivid and the anecdotes are more vivid. But the book is full of anecdotes, everything from their amusement at being at an auction and trying to be a little kind of shifty about what they were doing so that people wouldn't discover who was buying what and why. One of them buying one book and the auctioneer saying, and that one goes to the lady in slacks, and then the next one that's purchased, the auctioneer having to say, and that one goes to the other lady in slacks. And so there's a tone of amusement that runs through their kind of anecdotes or stories and about how they were perceived and dealt with in the book world. It's particularly strong on sections talking about how they managed during the period of food rationing in England when they were on book scouting trips in the late 40s into the 50s, and how they managed to cook in their hotel rooms and how they managed with intensely rationed food, and how to negotiate the black market to get better quality or even enough food. And lots of interesting details around how booksellers kept their stocks and who was willing to let them just go through his stock, and who was likely to not have prices on the book, and once they picked the book, increase significantly the price that he wanted for the book. So, an amusing book, but probably a Marmite book. Most people are probably not going to be interested in this book. I thought it was fun though. The second one is also a Marmite book. I gotta read its full title here. We Harbor No Evil Design, Rehabilitation Efforts After the Halifax Explosion of 1917. So this came out in 2017. It's one of the publications of the Champlain Society. The Champlain Society is a Canadian historical organization, and they publish, and have published for decades, essentially collections of primary source materials, so letters, journals, that kind of thing, not usually reprinting material that had been published. So they're a great source for immediate materials to get a sense of the immediacy of the period. And David Sutherland, who died 2 years ago now, I think, was an Atlantic Canadian historian, very well regarded, very skilled, primarily interested in Nova Scotian history, especially the Victorian period. But he was tapped to pull together this volume on the Halifax Relief Commission. So when the explosion happened in early December of 1917, there was an immediate understanding that more than simple handouts were going to be needed. The whole north end of the city was essentially destroyed, largely by fire from the stoves inside the homes. And so the Relief Commission was set up and was funded largely by the federal government, and its purpose was to provide immediate support, so immediate things like clothing. People had nothing. In some cases they came into the hospitals naked. So immediate clothing needs, food needs, shelter needs, medical needs, And then in the weeks following, they're tasked with providing some kind of housing. Ultimately, that became barracks-like buildings that were temporary housing set up in public spaces. But they're also tasked with providing medical care and getting people to and from medical care. Most of the people who were injured in the north end of the city would not have had a car, would not even have had access to the trams that were running, because the trams didn't go that far up the city, and there wasn't actually a bus system running at that time. There were trams, but not buses. And housing, medical care, disability care. People needed assistance learning how to manage with no vision, so needed to be taught how to read Braille if they were willing to learn how to read and write in Braille. People needed help getting artificial limbs fitted, and that happened outside of the city, and that could be a protracted process of the wounds healing well enough so that you could go to essentially Handsport, which is 1.5 hours outside the city, to be fitted for an artificial limb, which would have been wooden at that point, specifically carved for them. And housing, not responsible for education, but they were responsible for making sure children were actually going back to school. That was not always an easy thing to accomplish. It was a particularly well done collection, I think. It's divided up into 4 sections. We've got a section on the widowed and widowers of the explosion, the disabled people of the explosion, typically people who are blinded or had amputations, children. There were a significant number of orphans as a result of the explosion, and what's called, I think they called it marginalized groups. So that would be the Mi'kmaq people, black people, immigrants, the very, very, very poor in the city. Each gets its own section, and each section has upwards of 10 to 15 collections of documents, essentially a case file that the social workers who came from Montreal and Toronto and Winnipeg, and a handful from New York and Boston, to help manage the distribution of aid to all of these families who needed assistance. And these social workers collected multiple records, as you'd expect. There was paperwork to fill out, there were interviews to be had, follow-up conversations, and it's all recorded by Sutherland, transcribed by Sutherland, and probably his graduate student team, verbatim. There are very few gaps in the records, and so you can see the patterns in how aid was distributed and what kinds of people were received more favorably, kindly, and which weren't, and the way the kind of bog standard social prejudices of the day influenced who got what kind of assistance and what kind of credibility the survivor had or didn't have. It's really quite a thing to take these very essentially bureaucratic records and find the ones in which you can both hear the distinctive voice of the person creating the record. So this bureaucratic cadre of university-educated women, mostly working in social work fields, and in a very indirect way, the actual voices of the people who were displaced and whose lives were devastated. It's a lovely thing. It's a very good book to read if you could get your hands on it. You'd have to read it through a library, I think, or get it through a library alone. It gives you a really good sense of the material culture of the period. The amount of physical labor the women of the period did to maintain their households, and the neighborhood that was destroyed. There were 2 neighborhoods that were destroyed. They were largely middle class and working class families living there, and the labor of maintaining a household, it was significant, and you can see that in the kinds of compensation, because these survivors were, most of them, compensated and had lifelong disability or compensation pensions. Things like women being given extra money so they could hire someone to do the laundry. The laundry was an arduous thing to do. You had to heat water, you had to do a lot of it by hand, and you had to hang it up by hand. In the winter, it would have been cold. There weren't electric dryers at that point, and electric washers probably not a thing in these homes either. Homes were heated by coal, so coal is a very dirty fuel to heat with, and so the the homes would be dirty if someone couldn't maintain them. And then not all of these homes had, especially those that were apartments in the poorest part of the neighborhoods, not all of them had running water, so that if you lived in the third floor flat, you may have to carry water upstairs. It's quite illuminating to give a sense of just the physicality. The other thing it's really good at is giving you a glimpse into family structures and household structures. Most of the houses had multi-generation families. Many of them would have a surviving mother, a series of adult children, some of them with their spouses and children also living in the household, some of them relying on the army pay of sons who in 1917 would not be able to come back from the front to support their mother, households with 15 and 14-year-old girls leaving school to go and clerk, some of them quite happily to be working rather than going to school, but to provide the family with an income. And it's one of the kind of great joys of primary records, and primary records with very little interpretive filter between you and the record, is getting this kind of sense of what the lived experience of the city was like in 1917 when the U.S. had just entered the war, things were not going well, and then the city exploded. The things that are not particularly well done in the book, it's unfortunate, is the maps in it are poorly done. There wasn't enough care taken with understanding how various grayscale was going to reproduce on the page, and they probably should have taken another crack at the maps, and it's not particularly good at giving you a sense of the topography of the city, of how hilly it is, and how steep some of the hills from the harbor are, and the role of that steepness, and it varies along the coast, played in who survived in the explosion and who did not. And it doesn't, since mostly survivors of explosions, it's not particularly strong on the impact on the industrial area of the city. There's a tin foundry and a cotton factory and a sugar plant along the harbor, and all the men and women and children working in those places, almost all of them died. Everybody in the sugar factory died, everyone in the cotton factory died. It's not particularly strong there, but on the whole, it's one of the standout reads for me of the month, and yes, a Marmite book. How many people are going to be enthusiastic about reading a collection of historical documents about a terrible, terrible event? But bureaucratic records are amazing. If you can find someone who can do the right kind of combining and interpretation for you, amazing. Amazing that this stuff survives, and that you can get, by reading these records, a lived sense of a human being at the other end of essentially time, more than a century ago. The other thing maybe I'll touch on is I got to read, I'm about 2/3 of the way through it, some Elizabeth Hardwick short stories. I've never read her before, and I'm quite enjoying them. I'm not a short story fan. I prefer something with more of a plot, but these, I think, were surprising to me. They were surprisingly good, and I think it's because of what she does with her sentences. It's a sentence that will start out going in one direction and kind of a positive looking outlook on one of the rather uninspiring men in the short stories will suddenly turn and have a real sharp sting at the end of the sentence. So I've been enjoying those. So that's a long, rambly summary of how my no-borrow went. It went great. It may be really crabby. It did what it needed to do. And the 2 pieces of nonfiction I really enjoyed a great deal, and the one new discovery. So, memoir of 2 booksellers at a time when there were very few to no women bookselling, rare books, collection of records from the Halifax explosion, and Elizabeth Hardwick's short stories. What else should I read by her, I wonder? She's great. So that's it for me. I hope you've had a good reading week and that you have good books to read. Bye-bye.